I was just looking for a fantasy. I wanted to read a fantasy. I couldn't find one for the longest time. My reading was so up and down. I felt so down and out about reading. Like, will I ever read again? Blah, blah, blah. Well, hello, my beautiful bookish friends, and welcome back, or welcome for the first time if you are new here. My name is Lori Beth, and welcome to my little corner of the internet, aka my booktube channel, where I like to talk about all things bookish. Specifically in today's video, we're going to talk about my top reads of 2024. Because yes, my friends, it is the new year and I want to wish everybody a happy 2025. I hope that the year has been good to you so far. I am currently just surviving and not thriving. The flu hit me like a Mack truck this last week, and I was completely horizontal for a couple of days, and things were pretty touch and go there for a while. So with that being said, I would like to make a little disclaimer. If there are a few more cuts or edits in this video, it is most likely because I had to cut out a portion of myself going into a coughing fit, and that is really just not good material for anyone to hear. So we're going to do our best, but I am so excited to go over my top reads of the year with you guys. Like, quite literally just rehashing my favorite reads from 2024 is bringing me so much joy in these trying times. So when I was putting my list together, I was at first going to start with like my top 10 books of 2024. And then it got hard to do just 10. And then I kept looking at my list and I had even more books that maybe weren't like technically top books, but they were so close that I'm going to call them honorable mentions. So I think what I would like to do is start with the honorable mentions. It is a smaller list, and these are going to be in no particular order. And then we are going to move on to my actual list of top reads from 2024. Again, these will be in no particular order. I just could not bring myself to like order these from like worst to best. I don't know. I just love them all so much. And the more I thought about it, the harder it got. So no particular order for the list of top books or the honorable mentions, but we are going to start with the honorable mentions. Per usual, I do have a bunch of books precariously stacked on this side of the screen, so we're going to go ahead and jump right in. All right, so first up in our honorable mentions is a much more recent read, but one I'm so glad that I finally got to before the end of the year, and that is Lady Macbeth by Ava Reid. This is a retelling of Lady Macbeth with a kind of fantasy twist on it. I have talked about Ava Reid time and time again in my videos. I love her beautiful, whimsical, kind of atmospheric writing, and this book was very true to that style of hers. It was very dark, very gritty, and I liked that there was like a touch of romance in it, like a little bit of a forbidden romance, and also just a woman ahead of her time and kind of full of female rage. Like, this woman is going to do what she needs to do to protect herself. I loved it. I loved every bit of this story. Ava Reid is going to be an author that I will read for the foreseeable future. That is for sure. So, honorable mention, Lady Macbeth. And next up on our honorable mentions list is Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Sue Lynn Tan. I just loved this story so dearly. It kind of opened my eyes to a much different type of fantasy last year that I have never really read much of before. It is just chock full of beautiful Chinese mythology and following yet another incredibly strong and resilient female character that really just kind of tries to find her own way literally in this world that she lands in. It's very mystical, magical, and a little bit of romance, just like a touch of romance. Like, it's not the main part of the entire book, and I kind of appreciated that too. I think in this story, it was just such a beautiful blend of the fantasy, the romance, and the mythology, but mostly just the character development, like our main character developing over the course of the story. The second book was also just phenomenal. This is a duology, and if you know one thing about me, you know I love a duology. Highly recommend if you are looking for a fantasy that leans more into mythology. You cannot go wrong with this story. It is just absolutely stunning. And next up on our honorable mentions list is Penance by Eliza Clark. Now, let me tell you, I had a really difficult time as to where I wanted to place this book. And don't be fooled by this honorable mentions list, because these are basically just also top reads of the year. I just had to draw the line at some point. But this book just completely took me by storm. I didn't realize how much I was going to like Eliza Clark's writing. Like, I had heard really good things about her writing, but this was my first book by her. And this is a fiction novel that follows a narrator who is like a true crime journalist who has had some decent success publishing some of their work and accidentally got themselves canceled online. So they are going back in for one more attempt at writing and publishing another story. And the story that they choose to research is about this small seaside town. It follows a group of schoolgirls and a tragedy that occurs amongst this group of girls. This is a much bigger book than just like a true crime story. It kind of delves into our obsession with true crime, monetizing true crime in today's day and age, what is okay to kind of document and put out into the world about true crime stories, how it affects the people in the story, the people around them. It was much more in depth than I thought it was going to be. Like, it wasn't just a true crime story. Like, there was so many tiers to it. It was also kind of formatted in a much different way than I was used to reading. There was excerpts from like podcasts on here, which was really kind of interesting to like read through. Like, you're reading through transcripts from podcasts. Not every character in the book is there the entire time. So as you are learning about the story and about the people involved, each character is kind of slowly introduced. So you don't get like, you start with like girl A in the beginning, and then it kind of bounces back and forth between girl A and the narrator, and then girl B, C, so on and so forth. Loved the formatting of it and loved the writing. Eliza Clark is very, very quick-witted. Like, she is a smart writer. It's also a little bit like dark and humorous, which I appreciated. But overall, just like a phenomenal story. So if you aren't even really interested in true crime, I still recommend this to people, because it's not, yes, it's like a book about a true crime story, but it is not the main point of the book. Much more in depth than that. Highly recommend this one. Honorable mention from 2024. From there, we have I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman. And oh man, what a tiny little book with a big punch throughout. Like, I love books like this. I've talked about them a lot recently, about how I kind of enjoy reading some smaller novels these days, especially ones that are kind of poignant and really like leave a mark on you without having to be like 500 pages long. And I very much appreciate that. And like the season that I am in right now with reading. But this story was just very unique, very unconventional, and kind of post-apocalyptic, which I don't really reach for. It's not something that I would typically find myself wanting to read, but it was so much more than that. We follow a main character whose name we never learn, because she doesn't even technically know her own name, and she is held in this bunker underground with a group of women. They don't know why they're there. They don't know how they got there. They know they had lives before, but they don't remember a lot of details about the lives that they lived, and they are surrounded by guards. They are basically just kept in a giant cell underground. They're fed twice a day. They don't know what time of day it is anymore. They don't know if it's night or day outside. So as the story goes on, you start to see some character development within this group of women. What happens when there are basically just a group of people, like how hierarchies kind of form, how relationships form, and then as they go through the story and kind of like move on with their lives, how to kind of like form normalcy and like the scenarios that they are in. I don't want to give too much away, because I think going into it like a little bit unknowing is a good way to read this book. I just have to say it is kind of a very poignant story that stuck with me long after reading it. Like, I go back to this book a lot in my mind, and I really want to like recommend this to so many people in my life. Last up on our honorable mentions list is The Invocations by Crystal Sutherland. This is another recent read of mine and my second Crystal Sutherland book. Oh man, I just love her stories. I love them. Her first book, House of Hollow, was a YA fantasy, and this was as well. But her books are definitely a little, I would call them more like new adult than YA. Like they much more lean towards the adult side of things. They're very dark, very atmospheric. And this one specifically, we follow 3 main characters who kind of end up crossing paths because they start getting involved with the occult and kind of like some witchcraft and dark magic. And they end up needing each other to kind of get through this situation that they have gotten themselves into on their own accord. So I really like the way that Crystal Sutherland can write characters and write like relationships between characters, how they get to know each other, how their relationships build and change. But also like the very dark atmospheric vibe that she brings to her stories are just like top notch. Like I feel they're a little creepy. They're a little bit like earthy gothic, which is a vibe that I absolutely fell in love with from her first novel. And she did not disappoint in this one either. So if you like stories, especially about witchcraft and kind of like dark magic and also character driven books, you can't go wrong with this. It's such a good story. All right, so we have made it to my list of top books for 2024. Again, these are going to be in no particular order. I'm just going to start grabbing things from the stack and we are going to go over them and why they ended up on this list. Like they very clearly left a mark on me. All right, I'm going to grab this one and just kind of get right into it. I have talked about this book so many times, Alone with You in the Ether by Olivia Blake, another little tiny book that packed a punch for me. And it was my introduction to Olivia Blake as an author. And I think I'm really glad that I read this first out of any of her books. This is just a fiction novel of hers. She writes a lot of fantasy. This was a much different story because it follows 2 main characters who are kind of very troubled in their own way, and they end up crossing paths and forming this relationship with each other. And as time goes on and this relationship starts to build, they kind of become codependent on each other and almost like instigate the other person's not necessarily healthy behaviors or habits. But it also kind of forces them into looking at themselves and what they need to do to change themselves if they want to live a happy, healthy life and also have a happy, healthy relationship. I thought it was a beautiful look into like young people and young love and kind of just really finding your way in the world, especially if you struggle with certain things. So Olivia Blake herself has kind of discussed how she has struggled with her own mental health issues in the past and how writing has very much been cathartic for her and its own sort of therapy, if you will. And I think that really comes through in this story. It's like you can tell this was written by someone who has had their own struggles with things and has maybe even had their own struggles with like toxicity in relationships or trying to build healthy relationships. I just loved the story. I loved both of these characters. I just wanted such good things for them. And the love that came from this book was one of those loves that was like knock you off your feet, like passionate, undying, burning love for someone. If you've ever experienced that in your life, you kind of know like that feeling, like that deep, deep guttural feeling of love for someone. Like all of that in this tiny little book, which sounds very dramatic, but I'm telling you, I would reread this year. I loved it that much. So highly recommend this. Even if you don't love Olivia Blake's fantasy writings, I would suggest giving this one a go. It's much different. It's nothing like her fantasy novels. It is a book that truly left me feeling so much, and I go back to it time and time again. From there, we have The Serpent and the Wings of Night by Carissa Broadbent, and I gotta tell you something. I fell head over heels in love with not only Carissa Broadbent as an author, but this world and this storyline. I didn't think that something was ever going to hit me as hard as ACOTAR, honestly, ever again. And this is really right up there. Like, Carissa Broadbent to me is a very phenomenal fantasy writer. And in this series specifically, we follow a girl who is raised in a world where vampires and humans coexist. She is raised by like a vampire king. She is a human. She has been raised with the knowledge that she is very fragile because she's human, but she has also been trained to keep herself safe at all costs. She has like this undying and unwavering trust with this adoptive vampire king father of hers. So as she grows up, she enters this tournament called the Kajari, where if she wins, she will be granted a wish by like the goddess of this world, and she is going to kind of try to secure her safety in this world of vampires. So basically in this tournament, all of the participants are vampires, and she is a human, so she is already like 10 steps behind. And she forms an alliance with a vampire that is, of course, like not accepted by her family or her father at all, or in this kingdom that she lives in. So as the story goes on, she builds a relationship with this vampire, and towards the end of the book, towards the end of the tournament, things kind of just go awry, and her eyes are completely open to a lot of things that she did not really see coming, and that I did not see coming as a reader. So if you love fantasy books and you love something like a vampire trope or like a tournament trope, this was a beautiful blend of all of that, and it was so well done that I couldn't wait to devour the second book, which I did, and I just picked up the third book because the fourth book will be coming out, I think, mid-year this year, I want to say. That sounds about right. I was just like completely blown away by Carissa Broadbent's writing. Like, if you have heard about her, there is a reason, and I can fully attest to that. Next up on our list is Strange Sally Diamond by Liz Nugent. Oh, I gotta tell you what. Another just completely gripping story. And yes, it does have kind of a true crime base to it. And that was not on purpose. Like, I did not really realize it was going to go in that direction when I started reading this book, or when I at least picked it up. I kind of went into it not knowing too much, just that the main character of the story was a little quirky, a little odd, but man, there was so much more involved than just like a funny, quirky female character. So this is a fiction novel that follows our main character, Sally Diamond, who at the beginning of the book is caring for her father, who is basically on his deathbed, and she knows that he is probably passing away at any moment. He jokingly says to her that when he goes, she should just put him out with the rubbish, take him out to the bins, and move on with her life. So what does she do when he passes away? She takes him out back and puts him in the incinerator where they put all of their garbage. This is not a spoiler. This is on the back of the book. So ensues like a whole circus of things happening because Sally struggles with some form of like, I want to say like social deficiency. Like, she doesn't really understand, quote unquote, like normal social behavior and dynamics. So she is a very black and white person. She can't really read between the lines of things. So when someone says to her a joke like, hey, put me out with the bins when I die, she's like, okay. And then she does it, and she doesn't really understand why that was so wrong when someone asked her to do it. She is an adult woman, and now she is going to have to live on her own for the first time in her life because she has always been kind of with her father, who took care of her until his end. And she's now just entering this world as an adult woman, learning how to live in society and live by society's rules. She starts to discover things about her past and where she came from, and it kind of opens this can of worms into why she is the way she is, because of where she came from, and that kind of goes into that true crime aspect of the story. This was just so witty and darkly humorous, but so heartwarming at the same time. Like, Sally is probably one of the most genuine, raw characters I have ever read in a novel, and I think about this book quite often. The depth of the story and the growth that happens from start to finish is kind of unmatched. And again, the writing is just very witty, and kind of has like that dark humor to it. So it kind of just makes it that much easier to like read through some of the harder things that are touched. With that being said, I would definitely check trigger warnings on this book, because as the story unfolds, there are some kind of like darker topics that are covered. But I think Liz Nugent was just an absolutely stellar author, and I can't wait to read more from her. And honestly, if you haven't picked this book up don't wait any longer. I loved this book from cover to cover. All right, and next up on our list is A Conjuring of Light by V.E. Schwab. And I would imagine that you're probably tired of hearing me talk about these books. Not only have I talked about them in wrap-ups or like auto by author lists, and I have a playlist of vlogs of me reading the series from start to finish. I can't get over it. I can't. This was another series that did something to me so deeply, like so internally, that I will never stop recommending it, and I will never let this go. I will never let this world go. If you don't know anything about this series, this is a fantasy series, and it follows our main characters, Kel and Lila, who come from quite literally like two different worlds. So they live in London, but this London has different sides to it, or different parts of it. There's gray London, red London, and white London, and then there used to be a black London. That does not exist anymore. And people used to be able to travel between the Londons, but that is no longer possible. And the only people that can do that are Antari, which is what Kel is. And that's how he ends up running into Lila. He can travel between the Londons, and he ends up in her London. And they have this kind of like fantasy style meet cute and get intertwined with each other. And so ensues the adventure of this entire series. But I don't know if there is a romance, like a slow burn romance, that I have loved more ever in a series. Like slow burn through the entire series, but in the most satisfying way. Like when I think about Kel and Lila, it gives me butterflies in my stomach. And it's not just the romance, it's them kind of learning and growing from each other, like the juxtaposition between the two of them, what they give to each other, them helping each other get through all these trials and tribulations to kind of keep London the way it's supposed to be and fight like these dark forces. It is just top-notch fantasy. So if you like fantasy books that are not so like romantasy, this is a great option for you. Again, there is romance in it, but it is kind of more of that slow burn. It's not a spicy romance. It's not going to be like in your face, like they're just banging every couple of chapters. That's not what this book is about. This book is built on the characters, and the plot itself is just so phenomenal. Like the world building and the magic system. I don't know if there is a true fantasy series that gives me all of the things I love as much as this one. I still obviously have very strong feelings for this book, this series. And I love all of them equally, but I went with A Conjuring of Light for one of my top reads because, man, I just had a total mentee bee when I came to an end with this. Oh, love it. And moving onward to a book that I'm here for it. I love it. I don't care what people say about this book. I know how I feel about it, and I stand by it. And that is House of Flame and Shadow by Miss Sarah J. Maas. Oh, look at this. Look at this thick girl. I love a chunky book like this, like a chunky fantasy. If I'm going to do a fantasy, I want it to feel substantial when I'm holding it. And I love this series so much. I can't believe the hate that this book got. Like, I'm not sure what I read compared to what other people read. And I know everybody is entitled to their own opinions. That's not what I mean. I also just think I have a very special place in my heart for this series that I just love it so thoroughly. I don't think there was really anything wrong with this book. I'm just going to be honest. So as I've said ad nauseum, how much I love Sarah J. Maas and how I kind of stumbled into the world of her books a completely like backwards way. I started with Crescent City, like the first Crescent City book. Like what? Like who does that? But I just quickly recap the story. I was just looking for a fantasy. I wanted to read a fantasy. I couldn't find one for the longest time. My reading was so up and down. I felt so down and out about reading. Like, will I ever read again? Blah, blah, blah. I found Crescent City and I was like, wow, that is a really cool looking book. I love it. It's red. It's gold. I like the sound of this with fairies and like angels. Took it home, never looked back. And then I just basically devoured everything that Sarah J. Maas has written. But I think because I introduced myself to her from Crescent City, I became so thoroughly in love with that world. And the fact that it was a urban fantasy was so perfect for what I needed at the time. Like, it actually worked better for me than just jumping into like a very highly involved, like high fantasy world. I needed something that kind of gave me a blend of like, okay, this feels like my life, but like elevated with fantasy elements. And that's what the series is like for me. This book in particular, I'm just going on a rant now, I'm sorry, but this one in particular, I loved so much because I got to be so much closer to more characters in the story. And you know, I'm a character girly. I love character-driven books, and being able to get to know extra characters in this storyline in more depth, I really appreciated. I love Bryce as a female character, and one of the things that I appreciate about SJM writing females is she has this tendency to write like characters that don't ask for permission. Like, her female characters just make choices, like don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness later. And I know that's not for everybody, but I appreciate that. And just, again, this whole world, I love the urban fantasy setting. I love Bryce and Hunt together. Talk about a romance. And this is like a true romance. Like, this is a romantasy series, and definitely on the spicy side of things. I feel like now I'm just kind of going on a tangent because I think I take this one very personally, that there was so much hate for it, which again, I get, everybody has their own thoughts and opinions. But I love this world. I love this world so much, and I hope it continues. I hope that she never stops writing books because I just want to keep reading them. I'm addicted. I don't feel bad about it. Let's go a completely different direction. Not many romances end up on my list. I do enjoy a contemporary romance, but they don't always end up in like my top books of the year. But I gotta tell you what, Check and Mate by Allie Hazelwood just completely stole my heart. Oh my God. I don't know if Allie Hazelwood can do any wrong. I've actually kind of fallen behind on her books. I need to get better this year at kind of like sprinkling them throughout. But there was something in particular about this story that just, again, it just stole my heart away, and I loved it so much. So this is actually a YA romance, and I'm kind of wondering if that's what it was, because it brought all of those fun romance tropes to a book and just kind of turned down the spice a little bit. So it wasn't so much in the forefront and kind of like at risk at overwhelming the story at all. But this one was also just really fun because of the subject matter of like these characters. So we follow a main character named Mallory, who used to be really into chess, like phenomenal at chess, until some like tragedies occur in her life, and it kind of like makes her want to put that part of her life in the past and just kind of move on. Her friend kind of ropes her into this charity tournament as a team, and as she's in this tournament, she ends up beating like the top chess player in the country on accident. So ensues this like dive back into the world of chess, and her kind of building this relationship with this male chess player. It was just so fun, so deep, because of the things that our main character Mallory is kind of now having to face from her past as she has decided to step back into this world that she does have a passion for. And this really beautiful romance that kind of blooms between these two characters. They have much different personalities, which is always super fun. And in this case, Mallory is kind of actually like the popular bad chick. Like, she's very confident in herself. And Nolan is like this big nerdy guy because he's the chess player. But they have this really cute, sweet dynamic between the two of them because of their personality differences. Typical to Allie Hazelwood, it is chock full of witty banter, stuff that like makes you kind of kick your feet and giggle. And again, I think because it was a YA romance, it really brought forward in the book a little bit more of the storyline and the character development, but also gave you like that fun like butterfly in your tummy type feeling from reading a romance novel. So if you are a fan of romance, but you're not a fan of spice and you haven't picked this one up yet, I highly recommend it. It really gives you kind of like that perfect blend of like a true romance, like, you know, those fun like rom-com tropes, but also having like a storyline and character development in it. It was just such a good time. Like, what a good time this book was. Oh, I love Allie Hazelwood so much. All right, hang in there with me, you guys. We are quickly chipping away through our list. We only have a few more books to go over. And next on our list is Intermezzo by Sally Rooney. Oh my gosh. This could be like actually top contender for #1 book of the year. But Sally Rooney is a favorite author. I think she might be, no joke, like top favorite authors of all time. I have loved every book that I have read by her, but this one takes the cake. And I don't know what she is able to do. Like, there's some kind of like formula that she has developed in her storytelling that just works. Like, she writes people so well, so thoroughly. They feel so real, so raw, so vulnerable. And sometimes you really don't even like them that much. Because of the way she writes them, you become so fully invested in their development that you can't help but like keep reading. Like, you want to see good things come to these people, or these people figure their shit out. And this was on another level, though, of what she has written in the past. So her books are fiction novels, and in this story, we follow two brothers who have just lost their father, and they have quite a big age gap. I think it's like a 10-year age gap. And the older brother is a lawyer who has kind of just been like living this responsible life. He does all the things. He goes to work. He works the 9 to 5. He pays the bills. He helped take care of the father when he was ill. And then there is the younger brother who is just kind of finding his way in the world. He's in his early 20s. He's kind of like in between jobs. He is also a chess player, so he does that kind of on the side to keep making money. He doesn't really know what he's going to do with his life. He's always like in between paychecks trying to pay rent. And these two brothers are just like miles apart as far as personality and behavior goes. It was just a really beautiful story about what loss can do for people personally. So it was like each of like these both of these brothers individually, but then also them kind of figuring out their relationship like as adults, and as adults that have just dealt with some kind of trauma and loss. It was so impeccably written, and the characters alongside them in the book that I just absolutely fell in love. I was like rooting for every character in this story. I couldn't get enough of it. Couldn't put it down. I think this could be a reread for me. It was that phenomenal. Like, if Sally Rooney doesn't continue to put books out into the world every year, I don't even know like what I'm gonna do with my life. I know that sounds so dramatic, but I have been known to be a tad dramatic. All right, so stepping back into another fantasy novel, and that is Wisteria by Adeline Gray. So this is actually a YA fantasy, and yet another world that I just think about constantly. It's so comforting to think about this world and the characters in this world. So if you've not read this series at all, this is actually the third and final book in this series. Dagger in my heart, because I didn't want it to end. So the series starts out with the first book, Belladonna, and following a main character named Signa, who is quite literally like touched or kissed by death, I guess you could say. All the people in her life basically just keep dying and meet untimely deaths. And she has a way of communicating with death himself. And as she gets older, it kind of like the story unfolds as to why she's able to do that. She ends up developing a very prominent relationship with her cousin Blythe. And over the course of the series, we get to know Blythe more, and that's where the series ends. This last book is basically about Blythe with Signa still being involved. But the series itself gives such a beautiful, like, gothic blend, kind of like that earthy gothic vibe, because there's always kind of these big manors, like think Bridgerton style manors, surrounded by like plants and berries, but they're all poisonous. And there's also this blend of kind of I don't want to say like fairy tale, but kind of fairy tale, because there's like death involved and there's fate involved. And it kind of creates like this perfect little package of so many things in a fantasy story. But this was another one that kind of just like took me for a ride as far as like the characters and becoming very invested in the characters and seeing what was going to happen to them and the romance and the relationship and just how it was all going to kind of wrap up. I was so like happy with the way that the series ended. And I think sometimes I struggle with that. Like you finish a series and you didn't get exactly like what you wanted out of it. Not the case for this series. It was honestly just like a perfect ending to a world that I didn't want to leave. I loved it so much. Adeline Grace is a very beautiful and very romantic author. So if you haven't checked out this series, what are you waiting for? Oh, it's so good. All right, staying on brand with my fantasy trend, because as I'm sure you've seen throughout this video, what my preferred genre is. It's funny because sometimes when I'm like reading throughout the year, I'm like, I feel like I haven't read that much like fantasy this year. And then I put a list like this together and I'm like, oh, I actually do read like a lot of fantasy. I just always have room for more, I think is what the problem is. Next up is a book that I really, truly enjoyed. Like, I wasn't sure if I was going to. I thought it was going to be good, but I didn't know it was going to be like fall in love with it level. And that is A Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness. I'm not trying to be a basic bee, but I'm telling you what, I'm in it. I love it. I love this series so much. And I have read all 3 books in like the main series up to this point in time, but I put the first one on here because I think it's the one that really meant the most to me. The last, like the 3rd book that I just finished was, it was phenomenal. I loved it. But there's something sometimes about the first book in a series that just kind of sticks with me. It's like going back every year and rewatching the Harry Potter movies and being like, oh man, like the first one, you're like, when you're first meeting them and what that means, like how it just like sticks with you. And I think what I loved the most about this is it kind of really putting together some of my favorite things to read, which is 1, fantasy, and 2, dark academia. So in this series, we follow a main character named Diana Bishop, who is a witch and is a scholar at Oxford University. So she is both a professor here at Oxford, and she also does her own studies within the Oxford Library herself. As she is in the library one day, she accidentally like summons this magical manuscript, which she doesn't even understand how she really did it, but she knows it's magic as soon as it appears in front of her. Like she can tell like the energy in the room changes and everybody around her is kind of like reacting to this manuscript. So she then gets introduced to another character in the story named Matthew, who is a vampire, and he kind of gets involved with her because of this manuscript, and they start to kind of join forces, work together, if you will, to figure out what this manuscript is. If I had to like really summarize this series, it to me is like if Twilight and Outlander had a baby. Like, say less. Say less. I am going to eat that up with a spoon every time. This gave historical vibes. It gave academic vibes. It gave me witches and vampires, plus other like mystical creatures are involved in this story. It was just so well done and also kind of urban at the same time. So you're getting quite literally anything you can imagine in this one book series. But above all else, if you are a fan of Outlander and you do like fantasy, you can't go wrong with, like, you have to pick this up. You have to give this a go. I have, like, immediately when I finished it, I texted like a handful of friends and I was like, add this to your list if you have not read this book. Like, it is all it is cracked up to be. I am very excited to continue on with this. Like I said, I read the first 3 books that are like the original in the trilogy. And I know that there are some kind of, I don't want to say, I don't know if they're spin-offs. I don't know much about the other books, but I am planning on reading them because I really enjoyed Deborah Harkness's writing. This is just so very much, this is very much like an adult novel. And I really, really loved it. Can't recommend this enough. If you love any of those keywords that I just like blurted out at you. And next we have another one that I'm telling you what is like a top contender for maybe like favorite book of the entire year. And that is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. I feel like I've just like talked so much about this book, and I don't know, I want to keep apologizing, but also like, isn't that the whole point? I just talk about books all the time. I have to admit, I was a little nervous to read The Secret History because I had such high expectations for it that I was like, there's no way I'm not going to be disappointed. Like, this book is just going to disappoint me because I want it to be so good. Guess what? It was that good. It was so good. It was like 6 out of 5 stars. I have never been so thoroughly in love with a setting and a group of like eccentric characters. I just loved every bit of this. I loved how the story started and then how it unfolded. Like, it's kind of like that setup of where you know something right at the beginning of the book, and then you spend the rest of the book figuring out how you got there. I love that layout. Like, a format of a book like that is very gripping to me. Like, give me a little breadcrumb, like give me something, and then let me follow the trail. Like, I want all of the details. And for those of you that don't know what this book is about, this is a fiction novel. This is like a dark academia novel, and it follows a main character who finds himself kind of like uprooting himself from his California life to this small New England college. Like, he is not loving his life in California. He feels kind of like stuck in a rut, and he basically just applies to this New England college, gets in, and just leaves everything behind and starts anew at this college. When he's there, he starts to develop a relationship with this very small, kind of exclusive group of students who basically study under one specific professor the entire time. So it kind of like sets them up already, like they're in like the small school setting, and then now make it even more small and exclusive by being part of this professor's like immediate group of students. Each one of these students has a very different personality, but they kind of like play off of each other, true to like a dark academia novel. Some kind of like unsavory, diabolical things start to go down within the group, and then the group kind of starts to crumble from within. It's everything I love in a dark academia novel. It's dramatic, it's compelling. Like, the story itself is just so gripping, and also the setting. Like, the way that Donna Tartt writes and describes things, I could just feel myself there at this college. And I'm not gonna lie, I incorporated part of the audiobook alongside this, which 100% recommend, because I don't know if there is a voice in this world that could soothe my anxieties and my troubles the way that Donna Tartt's voice does. Like, I can hear her voice in my head sometimes, like when I'm driving, and I would listen to anything I would listen to her read her grocery list to me. Like, that's how much I love it. I can 100% say that this lived up to the hype for me, so much so that it is one of my favorite books of all time. It is my favorite dark academia book of all time. And I'm not gonna lie, I think it might have been like one of the top reads in 2024. And I said these are in no particular order, but this one is up there, and I am very much looking forward to reading more Donna Tartt this year. The only thing that scares me is how much I loved this, and what if I don't love her other books as much as this one? What would I do with myself? I guess we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. All right, my friends. We are coming in for a landing here, and coming in for quite a landing, if I do say so myself, because this is the largest book of the year, the largest book I have ever read, and it was actually the first book I read in 2024, and that was Kingdom of Ash by Sarah J. Maas. And talk about a thick girl, talk about that chonky book. You know, I love it. And if I'm being honest, a book that just kind of broke me, but like in all of the best ways, if that's feasible. I don't know. Does that make sense? But yeah, this is probably, again, one of my favorite books I've ever read, and in contention for maybe like best book of the year. Like I said, it's kind of hard to pick, but this is right up there. And it was the ending to a world and a series that I wasn't sure I was prepared for. I like mentally going into this, I was like, I don't know if I can handle it. But I wanted to read it in January because I had spent the entire year of 2023 kind of working my way through the Throne of Glass series. And I wanted to have a fresh month and like a whole month to just sit with this book. I didn't want to feel rushed. I wanted to take my time. I wanted to absorb it. And it was so worth it. It was so worth it to just go through the entire world. And I appreciate it. Like the more time I spend away from it, oddly enough, the more I appreciate it. And I think that's what makes the entire Throne of Glass series different from the other series that I have read by Sarah J. Maas. So I'm sure most people know the premise of Throne of Glass, but if you don't, just a quick recap. This is a fantasy series, surprise, surprise, and it follows a main character named Selena, who starts off like kind of quite literally like a very broken person. So throughout the first book alone, Selena starts to kind of rehabilitate a little bit and stand on her own 2 feet. But the series gets like very, very involved. Like so much so, like the world starts to build and build and build. Selena goes through all of these like transformative things throughout her life, like kind of discovering who she is, where she came from. But also you get to really delve into multiple characters within the series over like each and every book. And I loved it so much. I thought that the way Sarah J. Maas took her time to kind of build out these books, to build out these characters, and then bring it all together in this last and final installment was just unmatched from anything I have ever read before. And this is technically the first series that Sarah J. Maas has ever written. It's Throne of Glass was the first book that she wrote. And I think she was like 16 or something when she published that book. So I will say I've heard a lot of people not necessarily loving Throne of Glass on its own, like as its own book. And I can kind of understand why. Like once you get through more of the books, you can almost see Sarah J. Maas's writing kind of develop as she is developing herself as a woman and an author. So all I can say is if you were on the fence with Throne of Glass and you're not sure if you should continue, I highly recommend sticking with it. Each book, in my opinion, gets better and better. And also, this series is much more, I don't know if you can necessarily call it like high fantasy, but it's not as like romance heavy as her other book series. There's definitely romance, but it is a subplot of the entirety of the world that these people are in and what the main goal for this storyline is. So this is definitely more of like a true fantasy series, and it gets better as it grows, the world building, the characters, all of it. I'm so glad that I took the time to read it, as in like I did not rush through these books. I wanted to be in the space with them, each and every one, as I was reading it. And Kingdom of Ash was a journey in itself. Like I sobbed when I finished this book. Like I turned the last page and I just sobbed, and I was like, I can't believe I'll never be able to read about these characters again. As I said, it kind of broke me. But clearly not so much that I couldn't continue on and read more Sarah J. Maas. Because here we are. All right, my friends, well, there you have it. Those are all of my top books, plus some honorable mentions for 2024. I can't believe that year has come to an end, and it was a phenomenal and transformative reading year for me, mostly because of this channel and because of every single one of you that I have connected with here. And I cannot thank you enough for constantly tuning in to listen to me yap and yap about the things that I like to read. Of course, I would love to know if you have read any of the books in today's video. What are your thoughts and opinions on those books? Or what were some of your top reads of 2024? Drop those in a comment down below. As always, if you liked this video, go ahead and hit that thumbs up button because it always helps a girl out. And if you want to make sure you don't miss any of my other upcoming videos, go ahead and hit that subscribe button too. And as always, it has been an absolute blast, and I can't wait to see you guys in the next one.